Good morning. I am Art Pope, and it's my great pleasure to be here, and I've just really enjoyed yesterday's session and meeting all of the students as well as supporters and scholars of President Calvin Coolidge. Now, I want to thank our C-SPAN audience for being here as well for the Centennial of when Calvin Coolidge became president, and consider how Coolidge's policies and values may guide us today. So what we can learn about the 1920s applies directly to the 2020s. I'm pleased to have joining us two guest speakers, Dr. Warren Harding III, and as you may guess from the name, there is a relationship there. Dr. Harding is the grandnephew of President Harding. He is a successful orthopedic surgeon, has served our country both as being the physician for the USA rowing team, USA swimming team, but also by being a lieutenant commander in the medical corps for the United States Navy during the 1970s. So thank you always for your service. And Dr. Harding is not just a relative, a descendant. He is a scholar of President Harding. One of his books is Our Common Country and Practical Idealism, the recorded speeches of President Warren G. Harding. So we will get wonderful insights from Dr. Harding. We also have with us Dr. William Beach, Bill Beach. He's not a medical doctor, he is an economist. Bill is the current 15th Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. He is a past chief economist for the Republican staff of the United States Senate Budget Committee. He has served in public policy as the Vice President for Policy for the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He was the founder of the Center for Data Analysis, including on economic policy at the Heritage Foundation. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Bill personally since he served as the president of the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. So we really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today and your insight over the years since the current Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, our topic today is budgeting. We all know budgeting. We budget ourselves intuitively and with planning. You know how much money you have to spend on this trip to Washington, D.C. You know how much you have to pay your bills at the end of the month. And if you're students and you have student debt, you made a careful decision, hopefully a very careful decision, on what was the value of your investment in your education that's going to give you a return, going to pay you enough, earn you enough money in the future, as well as satisfaction, fulfillment in life to pay back that debt. But what about spending other people's money? That's easy. And if you're government, you have the power to spend other people's money, both through taxation and debt. Calvin Coolidge said, quote, "Nothing is easier than spending the public money. It does not appear to belong to anybody. The temptation is overwhelming to bestow it on somebody." Indeed, President Coolidge and his philosophy anticipated what later became known as public choice theory. Dr. James Buchanan at the University of Virginia and later George Mason University won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1986 for a theory of public choice. And it is an important dynamic that explains why budgets tend to grow, taxation tends to grow, and debt tends to grow. And the core of it is that when you have a concentrated benefit that the government can give you through direct appropriations, subsidies, favorable tax policies, and regulation, then and the cost is widely spread among the taxpayers and the consumer, the public, you as individuals, then the parties that receive that concentrated benefit will pursue it and spend the time on lobbyists, lawyers, political campaigns in order to receive those benefits. And so how do you prevent government from always growing by that pressure to always spend more? And to be perfectly direct, I served in the legislature, and it's very true of Congress. One congressman will say, "I will support you on that appropriation for your military base if you will support me in getting that bridge built I need in my district." You never say, "Hey, in the good of the country, I'll not fund the bridge if you don't fund your military base." So when President Coolidge came into office, it was as succeeding course as vice president from President Harding. And President Harding and President Coolidge They counter that dynamics of public choice, the pressure to always spend more from Congress and the public as a cost spread, by providing the leadership and determination and discipline. Before 1921, there was no central budget process in the United States. It was almost shocking. So one of the major acts that President Wilson had vetoed before President Harding was the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. That established for the first time the Central Budget Bureau, which we now know as the Office of Management and Budget. It required all the department and agencies to submit their budget, gosh forbid, to the president first, and the president to balance the true needs of the people, and then submit the budget to the Congress. It also established the Independent General Accounting Office, the GAO. That started in 1921 as well. So the departments weren't just responsible for their own budgeting and accounting, but they had an independent arm looking at them, reporting back to the president, reporting back to the Congress. It was through this centralized budgeting process that we had discipline and looked at the competing needs of all agencies and looking at the broad impact, not just the concentrated benefits. And this process was very successful. From 1921, starting with President Harding, through 1929, the end of President Coolidge's term, they had a budget surplus every single year. They reduced spending by 53% and reduced the debt by 1/3. We'll hear more from Bill Beach, but obviously it's temporary in the news now, a debt ceiling challenge, the continuing growth of the national debt with annual deficits. And people ask, well, can we do anything about it? Yes, you can. Through the leadership and discipline, you can do that, and that's what President Coolidge and Harding were able to do. And indeed, when he retired, President Coolidge said, perhaps one of the greatest satisfactions of my administration lies in the very marked reduction of the national debt since I have been president. That is the legacy of President Coolidge that we need today. Now, with controlling your spending, actually reducing spending and generating surpluses, you can then address the taxation side. And as in taxation is directly related to budgeting. Sometimes people want to keep it separate. But as President Coolidge said, a government which lays taxes on the people not required by urgent public necessity and sound public policy is not a protector of liberty, but an instrument of tyranny. It condemns the citizen to servitude. And again, the starting point, taxes on people not required for urgent public necessity. And that is what the guiding budgeting principle was for President Harding and President Coolidge. And indeed, they started a massive tax reduction. When they came into office, the maximum tax rate in 1920 was 73% of income. That's for the wealthiest, but 73% of income. President Harding signed into law in 1921, along with the Budget Act, one of the first tax reductions, 73% to 50%. Then in Tax Revenue Acts in 1924, 1926, and 1928, they reduced it down to 24%. So you would think, great, significant reduction in taxes, more prosperity for the country, but how did we get a budget surplus and reduce the debt when we reduced taxes? Well, in 1921, when the top rate was 73%, the Department of Revenue collected $700 million. This is 1921 dollars, $700 million from the income tax. Of that amount, 30%, $210 million came from the wealthiest, from those earning over $100,000. Again, that's 1920s dollars. By 1929, the rate was down to that 24%, and that Department of Treasury collected more revenue, $1 billion from the income tax, and a higher percentage and more dollars from the wealthiest. For those earning over $100,000, 65% of the income tax was paid by them for $650 million. So they reduced taxes from 73% to 24%, yet revenue went up $210 million to $650 million. And one of the key drivers of this tax policy, again, goes back to leadership, was first President Harding and President Coolidge having a Secretary, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon. And he observed, it may seem contradictory, but more revenue may be obtained by lowering rates. And this was in the 1920s, which anticipated by 60, 70 years what became known as the Laffer curve. Now, Dr. Art Laffer himself says that this was not his original idea, but put it succinctly, if you tax revenue at 0%, income at 0%, you get zero. If you tax it 100%, no one has the incentive to work, to earn money, or at least not to report it, and you earn zero. So we're on the laughing curve to maximize revenue by a reasonable tax rate that still gives people incentive to work and produce. And in the longer term, on supply side economics, is that when you have lower taxation, that leaves more hard-earned money in your pockets, in your family's pockets, to spend and grow the economy, and for the employers to invest and grow the business. That will grow the economy, so there's a bigger base upon which to levy the tax at a lower rate and gain more revenue. You get on an upward spiral rather than the downward spiral we are in right now. But it all comes back again to leadership and philosophy and values in order to counter the inherent dynamics to spend more of other people's money, especially when we have the power to tax and borrow. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Harding, who can provide his insight, starting with his namesake, President Harding, and then President Coolidge. Dr. Harding.
Thank you, Art. First, I'd like to just say that it's an honor and a privilege to be here at this wonderful event. But I'd like to open by saying that I know this is a meeting to reconsider President Coolidge, but to complement the Coolidge story, it is important to reconsider his predecessor, President Harding, as well. I would like to thank the foundation for that opportunity. Senator Warren Harding and Governor Calvin Coolidge campaigned for the presidency in the summer and fall of 1920, a time of global economic downturn, government instability, and social unrest following the Great War. I'd also add the Spanish flu and other things made it even worse situation in that era. Harding's campaign slogans were a return to normalcy and think of America first. The word normalcy may sound a little odd to our modern ears, but what normalcy meant was a return to common sense where citizens and businesses could thrive. In short, in 1920, Harding and Coolidge were seeking a course to help the country find its old course and to recover peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all Americans. Harding and Coolidge asked the voters for a mandate to pursue this course through several changes, including giving the president authority to propose and manage the budget, cutting back the size of government in general, reducing taxes, which has been previously said in 1920 had soared to a top rate of 73%, and to implement a course of military non-intervention. Also, it was important to Harding that America serve as an example to the world. The senator from Ohio was a modest man, a newspaper publisher and editor, a man who knew the people. Some of his rhetoric was more than rhetoric. It was an appeal to the American soul. Most of us remember President John Kennedy's words, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." 45 years before, in his keynote speech at the 1916 Republican National Convention, then Senator Harding offered a similar call for civic action when he said, "America should be a place under which the citizenship seeks what it may do for the government and the country, rather than what the country may do for individuals." I've always liked to think that maybe that was a little bit of an inspiration for President Kennedy's words. But what it really means is it explains Harding's use of the term, "think of America first," which has been used by many different presidents in many different ways, but this was think of America first. In 1920, Harding and Coolidge won in a landslide with over 60% of the vote. Once elected, Harding did something remarkable. He immediately started to implement campaign promises. He steered through Congress the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. That new law gave the president authority over the budget and enabled him to decrease excessive spending. Second, Harding appointed many good men. Examples in this context of the budget are Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury, and somebody who's frequently forgotten, that Charles Gates Dawes as Director of the budget. The quality of these Harding choices was confirmed by their subsequent tenures. Director Dawes was to serve as Vice President under President Coolidge, and Mellon was to serve as Treasury Secretary through the Coolidge administration and beyond with President Hoover. I should also add that Harding had the good foresight to, for the first time in history, make the Vice President a member of the cabinet. With the death of President Harding, that proved to be a very special thing. Third, Harding and Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes called for and shepherded through the Senate the treaties of the Washington Disarmament Conference of 1922. The treaties resulted in a significant reduction of that era's weapons of mass destruction, the battleship. For this, he was twice nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. This move also spared the significant expense of an arms race. Coolidge would directly credit the achievements of this conference to Harding and say, when that treaty was signed, it marked an epoch in history. Fourth, the Harding administration commenced paying down the national debt, which had ballooned during the war years. And fifth, Harding led Congress in reducing the tax burden. The Revenue Act of 1921 cut taxes significantly, and it also settled a lot of uncertainty in the business community with how taxes were going to affect them. All this was accomplished in less than 2.5 years. Harding didn't get to finish his voyage, but he set a course so sure that when President Coolidge assumed the office, he could continue the course, and he made it a complete process much better. A couple of other points. Harding was a man who set out to accomplish his agenda not by fiat and decree, but by trusting and enabling his fellow Americans. All human ills, Harding once said, are not curable by legislation, and quantity of statutory enactments and excess of government offer no substitute for quality of citizenship. Like many of his predecessors and successors, Harding was not perfect. However, we can see why President Coolidge spoke of his predecessor in the following way. President Harding was preeminently fitted to serve the country in the disturbed and distraught period following the war. It would be difficult to find any peacetime period of a little over 2 years when so much that was beneficial was accomplished as during his administration. While we are gathered here to celebrate President Coolidge, let us also remember President Harding. Thank you.
Bill, as an economist, you have studied the pre-war years, that was then the Great War, unfortunately became World War I, and as Dr. Harding mentioned, also a flu epidemic, such as we just gone through the coronavirus, or still have it.
Let's hope we're through.
So what can you share with us about that time period and the lessons it applies to today?
Thank you very much, Art. And before I get to sharing, let me join Dr. Harding in thanking you for being our moderator, thanking the Coolidge Foundation for inviting us. This is just an extraordinary opportunity. For the BLS director to get out of his office is an extraordinary opportunity, and I'm just so pleased with the evolution of the Coolidge Presidential Foundation. I can't tell you what a tremendous accomplishment that is. So congratulations, Amity and the board. So let me start with a question, one that I think should be on our minds, frequently isn't, because we don't ask ourselves this question. Why do we study history? We know that history doesn't repeat itself, But also, Henry Ford was probably wrong in saying that it was just one damn thing after another. So why do we study it? We probably study it, this is what I'm thinking, because we recognize that we're facing many of the same problems. But that really doesn't make sense. 100 years ago was 100 years ago. But we study history a lot. If you go into a bookstore, if you go into any library, it is filled with historical books or books that are political science and sociology with a strong historical focus. There's a clear awareness that is truly unifies us with the most ancient of civilizations, that we recognize the permanency of our approaches to life, and we learn something from the past. So we study history for that reason. Now, again, history does not repeat itself, and every moment is different from every previous moment, but there is a continuity of something that draws us to historical research and makes us spend time with oftentimes very dry history, looking for something that gives us insight into a problem that faces us. And so I'd like to apply that thinking, if you'll permit me to say that's thinking, to this period that's before us, and to connect it to our own time. So we have two periods here that I think are significant. And I do believe the parallels between them are striking, maybe more striking than we give credit. This is the period 1919 to 1922. Just take that little period right there, and 2020 to 2023. I began to look at this. My sense was that there were strong parallels. There was enough energy in the parallels for meaning, but I was really struck as I began to look at this more closely. The 1919 to 1922 period had a very significant pandemic. Now, let's not de-emphasize the importance of that to that period of time. They were facing a pandemic that moved from the East Coast to the West Coast in kind of a steady flow. Of course, that steady flow was the propagating mechanism. The channel for that was the great railroad system, which had been developed in the late 19th century. And so it moved steadily. It didn't, in this particular case, the coronavirus, it moved like this as the aircraft went across the country. But both periods saw cataclysmic pandemic. And in both periods, the economic effect was very parallel. Significant disruptions to the labor force, to the talent pool, to supply chains, to financial networks, to international trade flows. You would think you were talking about the period we're in, or we have just come through, but we're talking about 1919 to 1922. 675,000 people, it's the estimate, it's probably low, died because of the flu pandemic, H1N1 pandemic. But that was 0.6% of the U.S. population. In the coronavirus pandemic, which, God save us, I hope we're through, at least I'm telling people it's over, and when BLS tells people something, it's definitely true, right? About 1.12 million people have died so far from COVID-19 and its variants, which is 0.4% of the population. So you can see there the impact, at least at the death rate. The infection rate was probably even worse during the 1919 period, but at the death rates are very parallel. Both periods contained a massive expansion of government budgets and publicly held debt. Now, we're talking about very distinct periods because in the 1919 to 1922 period, most of the expenditures at the governmental level were at the state level and not at the federal level. But the 1919 to 1922 period saw the beginning of significant increases in federal outlays and in federal debt. The U.S. government outlays, that is federal outlays, grew by 2,493% from 1916 to 1919. And why was that? Because we were fighting the Great War, and we just went from almost very low to extremely high outlays overnight. And then 340%, the outlays were 340% higher in 2023 than in 1916. So even after the war, outlays were higher. So we didn't come back down in outlays once the war was finished. This is the ratchet effect of federal outlays. You never come back once the federal outlays go up. They just seem to be going up and up and up. This is just a phenomenon. Publicly held debt grew from $3.6 billion in 1916. Imagine that. Our debt was $3.6 billion. Steve Forbes is there writing that number down. 3.6 billion in 1916 to 22.3 billion in 2023, which is a 519% increase. Now that, again, does not include the outlays and the general obligation debt of state governments, which was also going up. So we had a total government debt increase at the federal and state level, which was historic in its proportions. To our own period, between 2019 and 2023, outlays grew from 4.5 trillion to 6 trillion. Again, from 4.5 trillion to 6 trillion across a 4-year period, which was a 33% increase in publicly held debt, federal debt. Outlays. Publicly held debt grew from 22.7 trillion to 31 trillion, an increase of 37%. So from the standpoint of public finance, the parallel is absolutely striking, just absolutely striking. Both periods experienced sharp, rarely seen, and sustained inflation that affected nearly every citizen and business. Now, BLS existed in the war period that we're talking about, in the post-war period, but we did not produce the modern CPI, so we can't use today's CPI and compare that to a CPI produced in that period of time. However, thanks to the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve System is worth every penny when it comes to doing things like this. They have reconstructed a CPI for this period, 1916 to 1920, a CPI that's available at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve's website for those students who are looking for a term paper. And the cumulative price increases across that period, that's basically a four-year period, we ran at 84%. So we had an 84%, prices nearly doubled, in other words. It was a period of stunning inflation. Again, probably related to supply chains and outlays and monetary expansion, the classic sources of inflation. Between 2019 and 2023, BLS, the organization I head up, the CPI rose by 19%, which is a striking increase in prices. And both periods were populated by war, external disturbances, regional conflicts that threatened to derail modest rates of economic expansion. All right, so my premise is laid, I hope successfully, that there are striking parallels between these two periods, and so it is worthwhile, I think, as a result of this conference perhaps, for policymakers here in Washington to take another look at that period. Because why do we study history? We study history in order to find things in the historical record which inform the current process of decision making. And here we have before us a mine, a literal diamond mine, that should be thoroughly worked if we're going to solve some of the problems, which are very parallel to the problems they had then. And in another striking parallel, both periods saw major budget debates, as we've already heard. In the first, that debate resulted in the passage of the Apocalyptic Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 and its implementation by President Coolidge in 1923. That is, I'll mention in a moment, is far more important to U.S. history than it's given credit for, because it set up a system of classification and accounting which allowed us to see the problem. You know, you don't see a problem in life unless you have a system to classify it and identify it. You have to have those things. In the second, We are still waiting for the reconstruction of the badly broken Congressional and Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 and all the implementing legislation thereafter. But that is probably in the offing. We need to get that budget system fixed. And why? This is a stunning number. And this is a number that I just think this is great. How many CRs have we had since 1996? And the reason I don't go earlier than that is because there's a raging debate on the number of CRs before that time period. Okay, if somebody were to say, I asked this question to students yesterday at Morehouse College in Atlanta, where I gave a similar speech, and the best answer was 40. We've had 125 continuing resolutions since 1996, over a 27-year period. So divide, for those in the audience who are still in school, divide 125 by 27. We've had year after year in which the entire year was done under a CR. And that means that we were not making budget choices. We were not debating budget priorities. Okay, so history doesn't repeat itself, and that said, history is preserved and interpreted precisely because of the lessons it can yield for decision makers today. And this period between 1916 and 1923, as I've said, is a rich deposit of lessons that we should mine. And let me give you just a few of what I think those lessons are, and then I'll conclude. First, great crises should yield significant changes in public policies that enhance individual well-being and prospects for economic growth. Now, why is that a lesson? Because we are not given too many opportunities when the configuration of the mess we're in is so great as it is right now. With all of this transition and fervent change, we should embrace it. We should say, yes, hallelujah, we've got a marvelous opportunity for bringing about policy change. And I don't recommend policy change to the left or the right. That's not my job. But it is a wonderful time to embrace it. So this 8-year period starting in 1916 saw those challenges that I've listed, but it also saw the rise of great political extremes in and threats to the democratic process. You know, I don't know where this myth got started that it was boring back then. Oh my gosh. Cal, do you remember this? So many people have said that. But we believed there was a lot of people in this country believed that Soviet United States was on its way, and it was a serious debate. It was not benign. It was not boring, and it was filled with extremes. It was filled with tensions on the left and the right. It was filled with acrimonious debate. And that's why the theme of the President Harding's 1920 election campaign, return to normalcy, is so resonates. It so resonates. And yet today, here we have the same sort of tensions. The political center responded to these crises back then across all fronts, sometimes poorly, as in the immigration legislation which was passed. And I think we can generally agree that that was poor-led legislation. But more often, well, of which the Budget Act and efforts to achieve scientific taxations are great examples. So we know from the 1920s that faced with all the problems I mentioned before and the problem of extremism and great tension, there was a political center that acted, and it acted well. Okay, second lesson, in my view. The rapid growth in outlays was not as dangerous as the absence of processes to manage it. I think in our current debate, we get too focused on the numbers and less focused on the processes. We get 125 CRs, not because of numbers, but because we have processes that aren't working. So the rapid growth in outlays was not as dangerous as the absence of processes to manage it. Budgeting prior to World War I, as Art has pointed out, was so primitive and slipshod that it is virtually impossible to recognize it, given today's elaborate management processes. Imagine, however, what would have happened to public finance had the Harding administration failed to secure the Budget and Accounting Act. Without the capacity to set priorities and manage outlays, the spending growth during this period would have been followed in the 1920s 30s by truly excessive politically driven spending, the White House would not have had the capacity to tap it down. So the process really mattered. Coolidge is the greatest budget president in U.S. history. For no other reason, and I'll put Harding in there, Harding-Coolidge, for no other reason than the budget processes he put in place and the practices he established. And I really do think that we should have statues to General Lord and Calvin Coolidge and President Harding. Maybe they're small, standing outside the door of the current OMB director. Yeah, just to remind the OMB director. And finally, the sharp decline in inflation after 1920 might seem inevitable to some economic historians, and I've read a lot who are very casual about this. Oh, it was going to come down anyway. I doubt that. There's nothing inevitable about change. Just think about that statement. There's nothing inevitable about change. You don't know what's going to happen. And there's no reason for inflation to come down. We saw European countries at that very same time that our inflation was subsiding after the passage of the Budget and Accounting Act. We saw rolling, runaway, rapidly rising, sustained inflation across the 1920s. And in some of the most developed countries of Europe. Ours was an exceptionally quick recovery once the inflation was tamed. And the lesson here is that economic and monetary policy truly matters. It matters more in what it signals than in what it does. For example, new budget policy that signals an improved order and predictability in public finance can create more favorable grounds for doing long-term business with government, for commencing long-term private sector R&D, for growing and expanding parts of a business with a long-term hurdle rates and so forth. When the federal government signals that it is seriously controlling through new processes and new laws its own finances, the signal is more important than the act, because it says to businesses, entrepreneurs, young and old, it's going to be okay to take risk. New tax policy that enhances the prospects for investment and savings can have larger than predicted results solely from the serendipitous economic activity that more capital in the economy can create. So you may say, well, lowering the tax rate to this 23% or 17% or 15% will have this kind of economic activity. You will no doubt be wrong on the low side. Because anytime you add capital, you have an unpredictable but usually positive growth in output and in innovation. And finally, a government that regularly maintains orderly public finance practices is seen by investors and businesses as a predictable partner. This means, in part, that government can be priced in more easily. It's really important to price government in. If government can't be priced in, then you don't know what your hurdle rates are. You don't know what your risk ratios are. If you can't price in the actions of the state, then you don't really have the kind of clear vision of the future that allows you to take risk. And serious risk needs to be taken if we're going to change our economy in a serious way. Okay, so my message at this panel is really simple. The period after World War I, and specifically the Harding-Coolidge years, from vice president to president, offer guidance for our own and confusing time. It's a gift we should gratefully accept. Thank you.
Dr. Harding, the role of the vice president is very narrow under our Constitution, really presiding over the U.S. Senate and to be their successor. And the amount of participation the vice president has varied tremendously through history. You had Vice President Johnson succeeding President Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson was not only a former U.S. Senator, but a Senate Majority Leader and was able to further both the Kennedy agenda and merge it with his own. On the other hand, you had Vice President Truman, who was largely excluded from the Roosevelt administration from the cabinet, and famously, didn't he know about the atomic bomb when he became president and had to conclude and lead the country to the conclusion of World War II, the post-war years. You made the point that that President Harding not only chose Coolidge as his running mate and vice president, made him part of his cabinet, and they seemed to form a true partnership. Can you share any insights on President Harding's decision making in choosing Coolidge and entrusting Coolidge with those responsibilities?
Well, I think Governor Coolidge made a big impact on the country in the Boston police strike, of course. So he was famous and was a very popular person to be chosen for the vice presidency. But putting the glove on the other hand, President Harding was very eager to make sure that he had very, very good people in his cabinet. And Coolidge had very similar ideas, and that is borne out by the fact that the policies really remained intact for the Coolidge administration, and it worked out very well. It's nice that they had similar views and ideas and were able to work on the same process, didn't have to go backwards and reinvent the wheel. So I think that was a very smart move on Harding's part, and I think President Harding was very lucky that he had President Coolidge with him.
And we don't have visual effects for our C-SPAN audience, but in our booklet we have the chart of the scientific taxation top rates. And you can see, starting with the 1921 73% rate, that President Harding had planned out tax reductions all the way through 1925, and President Coolidge actually exceeded that when because they were able to reduce it down to 24% before 1925. So it was a true partnership. And Dr. Beach, you talked about the process, and it took the leadership and people to pass that Budget Act, because President Wilson actually vetoed a prior version, even though it would have empowered his office. Some historians have stated that the modern presidency started with President Harding and Coolidge with the Budget Act.
Well, I suspect that's true. You might want to backdate that and say it's the Wilson, Harding, Coolidge years, because part of the modern characteristic is that we are on a vigilant footing in a global setting. So that's Wilson, through international organizations, and we have processes and structures that we had to create to maintain that footing, but also to expand domestically. We should always remember that the expansion of our economy was principally done in the 20th century, not in the 19th century. We think of the 19th century as the great period of filling out the United States. States come in, with Gadsden Purchase, and so forth and so on. But really, the growth of capital and the labor force occurred between roughly 1875 and today. And the fact that the United States became the dominant power in the world, taking over Great Britain in terms of per capita incomes and capital structure in 1904, roughly 1900, evidences my point. So the presidency of the early years of this 20th century was challenged to rise to the occasion. We needed a different form of state-federal partnership and federal government than we had in order to simply accommodate the many needs of this growing population and growing economy. The Budget Act was crucial because I hope you've all read Amity's book, and if not, you should buy 4 copies each because Amity would like that a lot, right? She's not even listening to me. What we learn in there is that Congress had endless ideas of how to spend money, and they still do. I mean, that's almost their job, right? That's their job. It's come up with endless ideas of how to spend money, and so there needs to be processes both in Congress and in the administration that regularizes the channels in which those ideas get introduced to the debate, that prioritizes the debate, and that was all established through the processes started by the Budget and Accounting Act.
Going to have questions from the audience. We have the Coolidge Foundation assembled more than 100 students who are joining us at this conference. The students will have the first opportunity to ask questions. If you have a question, we ask that you please raise your hand, and Rob Hammer from the Coolidge Foundation will bring the microphone to you. When the microphone comes to you, please tell us your name, where you're from, and then ask your question. And we welcome questions for the panel, but we have some excellent guests here who will be speaking later. And so we welcome comments as well as questions. Have a good discussion.
And before we get started, I'm just recovering from a cold. I'm going to ask my breakfast partner, who would like to be on C-SPAN anyway, to bring me that bottle of water, which is sitting right there. Thank you so much.
Hi, Cormac Lynch from Cary, North Carolina. You mentioned the power of impoundment through the budgetary process. Do you know if Calvin Coolidge ever used his presidential power of impoundment for funds?
He was famous for using Abraham Lincoln's technique for stopping things, and that was just put stuff in his pocket and let the time run out, the pocket veto. I don't think but Amity can correct me on this, but I don't think that impoundment was employed. As you know, one of the most famous characteristics of the Coolidge years was his continuous pressure on agencies to cut. Now, why would he want that? I think he would want that because the outlays were so high, debt was so high relative to what it had been. And then each year, he would call all the agencies together, put them at Constitution Hall, and NBC Radio would come in and broadcast this berating of agency heads. I'm glad that he's not my president, by the way. And just berate them. And General Lord would walk up and down the stage and say, "Why don't you cut this? And how? I'm not going to give you another pencil until it's that long." That's kind of impoundment in a different way, isn't it? I mean, it's not impoundment of stopping money from being spent, but it is certainly the more direct approach on that. So it's not my impression that we had a lot of impoundment during the 1920s, but we had the material equivalent of impoundment.
My experience as that state budget director at the state level, but it is inherent and sincere by each department secretary that they need additional funding to accomplish their mission. It's just inherent in there.
Yeah.
And before the 1921 Budget Act, the agencies, the federal agencies and departments basically went to their specific committee. So agriculture went to the Agriculture Committee in Congress, and they didn't have to consider what the overall budget impact would be. They just wanted to get as much as they could, sincerely thinking that's what they needed for their mission. So President Harding-Coolidge, by centralizing the budget process and having a unified budget submitted to Congress, that preempted the need for impoundment. So it was that great, again, that leadership and discipline to counter, again, part of the public choice theory, the agencies wanting more money to do what they think they need to do good.
Over here.
Hi, thank you. My name's Arda Thaman. I'm from Ashland University with the Ashbrook Center. Hamilton and Jefferson disagreed on what necessary and proper meant. Hamilton thought it meant something convenient or helpful for the country, while Jefferson thought it absolutely necessary. Would Coolidge agree with Hamilton's view or Jefferson's view on when coming to decide when to spend money?
Question. That's one for Art.
I will go back to the quote I gave at the beginning. This is President Coolidge's own words. "A government which taxes on the people not required by urgent public necessity and sound public policy is not a protector of liberty." So I think he would definitely come down on the side of President Jefferson. Now, of course, as a constitutional law matter, the necessary clause got greatly extended almost beyond recognition on serving as any limitation. So Hamilton won the argument, but under President Coolidge's leadership, Jefferson's policies prevailed.
My name is Thomas Buckley. I'm from Colchester, Vermont. Dr. Beach, you talked about the need to think about the budgetary process more than simply like the headline budget number. So what lessons should the current budgetary bureaucracy learn from the Coolidge administration about reforming our budgetary process?
Good, great question. So I have some insight on that because for the last 4 years I've worked with this budgetary process. And let me just start with one thing that may be controversial, but I think it's true. I don't think either party wants to spend this country into ruin. I think there's too much. I think there's too much partisanship in our understanding of the budget. But they have different approaches. There's no question, different priorities. So if we start from the proposition that there is goodwill and that regular budgets are desired by both, and that they want to make sure that government is a predictable partner in enterprise, then I think we're in a safe spot to answer your question. The current budget processes are extremely detailed, extremely detailed. The normal thing is for me to submit a budget request to the department rakes it over, sends in a budget request as a department to the president rakes it all over, and it's not the top line numbers, it's a very detailed structure in there, going very detailed. And then all of that detail gets passed on to the House and Senate budget committees. I was the chief economist of the Senate Budget Committee Republican staff, so I got to see all these budgets, and the budgets would come in, they were, oops, sorry. Amity, I've broken everything. There we go. They were, huge amounts of documents, extremely detailed. And we would go through, we had dozens of full-time budget staff on the Senate Budget Committee. Then there are the appropriations committees, and they're just like they're a fourth branch of government. They're so big. So you see my point. My point is that there's huge texture and very detailed work going on here. And still we have 125 CRs over the last 27 years. So it isn't the will, it isn't the capacity, the number of people, it isn't the processes that we've set up to create detailed long-term, short-term, check-in, check-out authorizations. The National Defense Authorization Act is passed regularly in June. It has 5-year authorizations. Appropriations come in after that, and still the Defense Department's budget cannot be audited. It seems to me that there's a comprehensive break in our law. And so it is, I think, commensurate on Congress to do what the Harding-Coolidge team did and get the law right. It isn't the will, it isn't the details, it isn't all of that. That stuff is there and it's working, but it's still a broken system. So I think I'd have to go to a much larger point. It's not individuals, it's not malicious political actors. You can't blame it on the cat. It's the law.
Hi, Ethan Bishop-Henchman from Franklin, Vermont. From the latest issue of The Economist, Fox News spent about
Okay. How dare you? I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's relevant, thank you. Fox News spent about a quarter as much time covering drag queens and transgender people as devoted to Ukraine from June 2022 to February 2023. How did Calvin Coolidge break through the culture wars of his day to focus on good governance? And how should that inform our politicians today?
The short answer is the culture wars were not as prevalent in the 1920s as they are today. While federal government had grown continuously, usually as a result of war and under President Lincoln as a result of the Civil War, and then at World War I, the federal government was far more smaller. As Dr. Beach pointed out, as a percent of budget, it was a smaller portion than the state governments at the time. And there was not federal legislation on many of the cultural issues of today. So it really, I don't know what President Coolidge would, I'm not that good of a Coolidge scholar to know what he would have thought on issues in the 1920s that are now raging today on the so-called cultural wars, because it's more limited. So that's the best answer I got. I welcome anyone else in the audience who has any insight on the 1920s cultural wars.
Well, I did. I'll share one thing with you. And when I was in graduate school, first off, I wanted to be a historian until my wife told me that I couldn't make enough money as a historian. She was right. So one of the assignments I had as a first-year graduate student was to read all the articles in a popular magazine and then to report on that and do a paper on it. And there were lots of magazines, lots of newspapers. This was the golden age of magazines and newspapers. And I remember picking up a magazine, which I read, and I read a lot of it. It was called People's Daily. Like People's Magazine now, it's called People's Daily. Go ahead and look at it. It's okay. I mean, if you like to see Robert Taft in a tutu doing a ballet, that was happening back then. And seems to me there was an enormous amount of attention given to funny things in our culture, strange things in our culture. So in that sense, there's another parallel between our two periods. They weren't just thinking about budget numbers and economic growth. They were also thinking about President Taft in a tutu. So, I mean, it's just, or in that case, Supreme Court Justice Taft in a tutu.
Good morning. My name is Lorelei Godfrey, and I'm from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. My question is for Dr. Harding, but I'd love to hear the rest of the panel's thoughts on this as well. Dr. Harding, you mentioned that the Harding-Coolidge administration's foreign policy prevented costly arms races. And as you know, war is very expensive, and our current military budget is one of the highest in the world. Should our foreign policy change for the sake of a balanced budget?
That's a tough question, a very good question. And I think I can speak more for myself than I can for them, of course. But it seems to me that America has to be strong if we're going to be a good example for the rest of the world. And that's what one of the things that President Harding did particularly was he emphasized that it was America first. Think of America first, and that's really what he meant, was make it strong for Americans, and then by doing that, we could be a good example and do things for other people also.
Yeah, I just have a couple of comments on that. It's a great question, and one which we should really attend to now. So the National Defense Authorization Act just passed, authorized outlays, not appropriations yet, but authorized outlays of $828 billion, the largest defense budget in U.S. history. Now, many people look at that and they say, well, we should be spending it on roads and bridges and education, and right, in a perfect world, that would be spent that way. But to understand the defense budget, you really need to look below need to open the hood, right? 30% of that's in manpower costs, in salaries, wages and salaries. Maybe 40, a little bit less than that, is in benefits, primarily healthcare costs. So when you look at the actual part that would be used for munitions, for building new defense platforms, it is much smaller than the 828. On top of which, in 1990, we had 55 major contractors who did defense work, 55. We have 5 today. So the entire industrial base has shrunk tremendously. So our capacity to even spend the remaining money on munitions and new platforms is significantly reduced. Significantly reduced. And if you look at what does that mean? Well, our our efforts to help the people of Ukraine defend their country against the invasion from Russia is well known, right? We have spent enormous amounts of munitions, equipment, and platforms, platform meaning like a tank or whatever, sent them over there. Just the munitions to replace the 9mm to 122mm munitions. These are the shells. The current capacity, just to replace what we had, to bring us back to where we were, is 5 years. It was going to take 5 long years to get back to where we were. So part of what's in the defense budget now is an effort to revive the industrial base so that we do have the platforms and we do have the munitions necessary to fight now two different theaters, one of which was unexpectedly a land mass. We didn't think we'd ever have to do that again, right? We haven't made an M2 Abrams for 30 years. We need to start making that. And now we have this great threat coming out of the Asian Pacific area, largely from China. So that is a water-based, basically a water-based theater. We have two different theaters. So we have great threats with limited and declining capacity to meet those threats. And if you love your education, if you love your economic opportunities, you must have a defensive structure that's sufficient to defend those things. That's why this particular NDAA is so important and hopefully breakthrough so that we can restore some of the agency and capacity that we had 25 years ago, which we don't have today. It's a dangerous moment for us to be, but one in which we're courageously going forward and supplying stuff to Ukraine. But still, it's something that you really need to attend to.
My name is Danielle Miller. I'm from Baylor. My question is for Dr. Beach. Would you support eliminating the second mandate of the Federal Reserve to pursue price stability only rather than price stability and full employment?
Well, I have an extremely easy question answer. I'm not in my position able to take positions on policy change. So you have to ask me in a few weeks when my term is over. So maximum, what's referred to here is the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve laid out in the Humphrey-Hawkins Act and enabling legislation thereafter, especially in the Full Employment Act of 1946. That is that the Federal Reserve and other economic policy-making bodies aim to keep stable prices at the same time that they have maximum employment. I don't like the word maximum. I'd change that. I would say optimum. Maximum means you're constantly pushing for extremely low levels of unemployment and high levels of employment. That may not be appropriate at all times. So a larger problem might be this, and that is the monetary system the appropriate system through which those particular goals should be attained? Or is the monetary system really a reactive system that accommodates policy changes made elsewhere? I think that's a great question. Economists are asking that question seriously now. Who leads what? I had a professor one time, and my apologies to the Federal Reserve, but this is a historical reference and not a reference to the current Federal Reserve. Way back when I was in college, my professor said, well, just think about what is the Federal Reserve? Think about it like this. The Federal Reserve tries to chart a path to the future, but it's very much like a speeding car going down the Holland Tunnel in New York, bouncing from one side to another, at the end of which it says, we made it through in a straight path. So we may be asking too much of the Federal Reserve to execute that mission, but that's not answering your question, but I think that there's a larger question behind your question.
Let me go next. Oh, okay. Steve Hayward, currently an inmate at UC Berkeley. And, a panel on budgeting in the 1921 Budget Control and Empowerment Act. This is seriously wonky stuff, and I love it. But I'm sufficiently provoked by Bill Beach's presentation. The story arc I completely agree with, but I think things are actually even worse than you laid it out. So I want to make a provocation, and then following the Jeopardy rule, make it a question for you. Art Pope rightly points out we were the last major democracy to adopt an executive budget control system. That makes perfect sense in parliamentary governments, which are unified, but in our unique constitution with the separation of powers and the explicit Article 1 power of the purse assigned to Congress, it gets a little more murky. So here's my provocation to build on, which is the Budget Control and Empowerment Act of 1921 was a progressive's dream. Just try a thought experiment if Woodrow Wilson, healthy, had a third term, and he wanted executive dominance over Congress, and a progressive executive with a compliant Congress is going to go crazy with it. You don't need to do that thought experiment. You just look at Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, or our current president. But then in modern times, and you raise some of this, but I want to sharpen it a bit, we have this unusual circumstance where there's a split in public opinion. You have the second-term Nixon and Ronald Reagan representing a national majority, the only organ of our government that speaks for a national majority, on the side of limited government. And what happens? Congress then effectively, I think, in the 74 Act you mentioned, repeals the Budget Control Act of 1921. And so the best we seem to do, Ronald Reagan wanted a line item veto, and, Congress, as you point out, has never even completed their own process the way it's intended. So we don't really do budgeting anymore in any sensible way. So having cast some slight ambivalence about the 21 Act, I wonder if we don't need to bring that back, make it even stronger for when we have responsible presidents like Harding and Coolidge. Because that, I think, why it turned out well, you had responsible executives, and we haven't had a lot of that in the last 50 years.
Well, Steve, you've lived up to your reputation. Thank you for thank you for that very provocative question. And it is at the tip of a lot of people's tongues right now about what do we do with the Empowerment Act, Budget and Empowerment Act of 1974, Budget and Empowerment Control Act of 1974. Because it was created in a period of tremendous turmoil. 74, of course, is a pretty significant year in the history of the presidency, especially August 9th of that year. And Congress was attempting to weaken the presidency, I think, maybe intentionally because they thought it had become too imperial, too strong, too above the law. That's the favorable look on that. There's a history that writes. A line of literature that writes that Congress was making a play for power, and I think that there's a credible case to be made for that. So the birth of that act was very different than the birth of the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, which came out of turmoil, true, but came out of a lot of interests in the part of how do I say this, mainstream progressives to build a presidency that was strong enough for the 20th century. That was Wilson's kind of dream. It turns out that Wilson didn't have a third term. He didn't have a successor that was like him. In fact, something came in which was very much not like him. That was Calvin Coolidge. And so I think for the benefit of the 20th century, we got an interpretation of that act which was much more conservative and operational than a progressive vision would. I don't know. I may be wrong on that. Now, back to your point. So we do need to take a look at the 74 Act. And we have, the 2011 Act with the Deficit Reduction Act, which builds on that, and other legislation which is connected to it. So put all of that together and say, what can we do to resurrect a system that creates orderly budgets? And let the politicians decide on whether or not we're a left-leaning or right-leaning or center-leaning country. But at least put regular budgeting back in place, in which case you must have shared power. Congress is the first body mentioned in the Constitution for good reasons. It's the control of the purse, the control of spending. The modern presidency has to be strong enough to withstand the buffeting of priorities and the tremendous tensions which come by being such a large country with such large international control. That act is broken. And it needs to be fixed. And I know I have many friends who are very active in the reform efforts. They would see the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 as a good skeleton upon which to resurrect proper budgeting. So I would endorse that. say that we do have a model out there. Again, my main point here, what weak point I was making, is that there's a mine of tremendous insights out there that would lead us today, and one of them is let's go and see why we shouldn't have something like the 21 Act brought back as the 2025 Budget and Control Act. I think that would be a great step forward.
I won't give a quick answer to that. And again, my experience at the state level, I've been both the state budget director on the executive branch side and the legislature on the appropriations committee side as well. I really do think I understand the concern about the 1921 Act, Budget Act being part of the progressive movement, but truly the executive branch needs to exercise discipline over its own budget. Bill commented earlier about the stacks of material they got in Congress, but the day-to-day running of state government and federal government, it really does need to be delegated down to the agencies to prepare and administer their budget with discipline and guidance from above. Again, President Coolidge famously bringing in his department secretaries and telling them to cut, and be specific where. So it's an old joke that the governor or president proposes a budget and the Congress, the legislature, disposes of it. So they do act as a check, but they do also load up the budget. I mean, classic pork barrel. To me, the biggest advantage to the state governments is they're subject to constitutional limits on debt. They cannot just run an operating deficit. They cannot borrow. They can issue long-term bonds, usually for supermajority, different provisions in the states, but they just cannot issue debt. So to have a constitutional amendment to limit the ability to issue debt, I think would be a major reform, but it'd be so difficult to get a constitutional amendment passed. And a couple of states, and North Carolina's not done it as a constitutional provision, but it's a self-guiding provision, is we limited spending increases to population and inflation. It was a voluntary spending cap. So that's why in North Carolina, we could lower our taxes starting in 2011, our regressive sales tax, our income tax, and actually still increase spending, but at a slower rate and generated budget surpluses by keeping that spending increase to population and taxation. And North Carolina's been a very prosperous state. We've grown tremendously over the last 12 years. So reforms are needed. And that, again, going back to President Coolidge and President Harding, provides leadership to impose a process so they can exercise direction to stop that dynamic of wanting to spend more of other people's money when you don't have to pay the bill. The taxpayers and future generations, you in the future are going to have to pay for these debts.
Hi, I'm Luke Pollock, University of Alabama. We're very bad at football. I have a pretty simple question. There's pushes for universal health care, which basically means here, government tax should provide health care for anyone who needs it. What do you think a Coolidge or Harding approach to that question would be?
Government provision of health care? I don't think they would have supported that.
I mean, again, the simple answer would be no. They would not have supported it. They believe in the strength of a private enterprise, including the private provision of medical care. Now, Dr. Harding's a doctor, so I will defer to him. But there's been a continuing debate on how much beyond a safety net, particular Medicare, and we do have Medicaid, but that came obviously after the Coolidge and Harding administrations. But it would be such a tremendous part of the economy, and whether it would provide better care at a lower cost. And compared to other nations, I would argue it would not. But you're not asking me, but I think it's very clear from the Coolidge administration, his philosophy and policy, he would not want the government to undertake that expenditure, and thought that the private sector, the private enterprise, private practice medicine could provide better care at better costs.
I agree with that.
We're out of time for questions, unfortunately. It's been a wonderful panel. Mr. Pope, any concluding thoughts?
No, I just want to say what an honor and delight is here to be as guest speakers for the Coolidge Foundation. And as Bill and Dr. Harding said, we read history to learn from history. History doesn't repeat itself, but yes, if you don't know where you've been, it's hard to figure out where you're going to go. So, and the lessons of the Coolidge administration, starting with President Harding, are lessons that can be applied today, and I think are needed today. And I'm very encouraged by the students here today, our other guests, and I really appreciate the time and insight from Dr. Harding and Dr. Beach. Thank you.